Morning at Capitol Square Court brought a grim chill, not just from the weather, but from the storm gathering inside its walls. The courthouse buzzed with unease, staff whispering in corners, reporters circling the steps like vultures sensing change in the air. But inside the courtroom, the routine moved on, as if nothing had happened. Until Karoline Leavitt walked in. She wore a charcoal gray suit, hair pulled back, no makeup, no entourage. Only her presence and the silver cross that shimmered quietly beneath her collar. The room paused when she entered, a murmur of recognition passing through the benches, like wind through dry leaves. She didn't speak. She sat in the second row, alone. Today she wasn't a defendant. She was a witness. Upstairs, in a secure chamber of the District Judicial Oversight Committee, the real hearing was about to begin. Chairwoman Esther Klein, a seasoned federal jurist with piercing eyes, called the session to order. Karoline stood when summoned, flanked not by Secret Service, but by stacks of documentation, digital files, and a conviction deeper than law itself. "I appear today," she began, "not for retaliation, not for retribution, but for record, for history." She placed a thick binder on the table. This includes 17 testimonies from former courtroom observers, 7 audio clips, 3 confidential statements, and a 12-year case log from court clerk Doris Whitman, documenting consistent bias against religious expression. Silence. Every click of a pen echoed like a gavel. Karoline continued, her voice even, steady. "In this courthouse, Judge Vernon Clay has issued over 200 contempt citations tied to religious symbols. That's not a coincidence. That's culture." A pause. Then she looked straight at the panel. Bias dressed in black robes is still bias. Across the table, Alina Porter stood next, opening her report with the ease of someone who'd spent the last 72 hours without sleep. "We ran comparative data from all D.C. municipal courts," she said. "Judge Clay's fines related to visible religious symbols are nearly double the next closest judge. And 72% of those cases involved Christian iconography." She clicked to the next slide. Crosses, rosaries, hijabs, all cited. Meanwhile, cases involving provocative t-shirts, oversized chains, or even political slogans went untouched. "We believe this establishes a clear pattern of religious discrimination in courtroom enforcement." Karoline didn't blink. She didn't need to. The numbers spoke. Then came the voice that broke the room. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff, stood, his hands folded in front of him, shoulders squared. "I've worked under Judge Clay for 15 years, he said quietly. "I've seen him dismiss outbursts from defendants in skull-printed hoodies, but fine a mother for silently holding a rosary." His voice cracked, just barely. "It's not just what he punishes, it's what he chooses not to." Esther Klein leaned back. The air had changed. Clay had not yet spoken. He was seated at the far end, surrounded by attorneys but wrapped in silence. For the first time in years, the man who ruled his courtroom with absolute command looked small, diminished. The session broke for deliberation. In the hallway, Karoline stood by the window, watching the Capitol dome framed by gray clouds. Her phone buzzed. A text from Candace. "The video hit 1 million views. Liberty Channel just picked it up. They're calling you the crossfire witness." Karoline smiled, faint but genuine. Back inside, the panel returned. Chairwoman Klein cleared her throat. "After review of the evidence submitted, including sworn testimonies, statistical analysis, and internal court records, we are placing Judge Vernon Clay under immediate suspension, pending full disciplinary review." No applause, just a long exhale from the room. Karoline sat, slowly. She looked down at her hands. One held the binder, the other curled gently around the silver cross. Later that night, she appeared on Liberty Channel 7 for a live segment. The studio lights flared, but her expression stayed cool, grounded. "This isn't about me," she told the anchor. "It's about a culture that believes authority is too sacred to question. But the Constitution wasn't written to protect comfort. It was written to protect courage." "And the $500 fine?" the anchor asked with a smirk. Karoline's eyes glinted. "I paid it," she said. "Then I used the receipt as my first piece of evidence." The screen faded to commercial as her face lingered, framed by the banner, "Justice begins with belief." Outside the courthouse, a crowd began forming. Peaceful, determined. Handmade signs waved against the dusk. "Respect faith, reform courts. Equal bench, equal belief. Faith on trial." Inside his home office, Vernon Clay sat in darkness. The news played low on a muted screen. Footage of the committee hearing, Karoline speaking calmly, James Wilson testifying. He rubbed his temples, then reached for the remote, but didn't press mute. He listened. For the first time in a long career, he listened. The day after Judge Vernon Clay's suspension, Washington didn't just react. It shook. It started with a headline. "Faith on Trial, White House Press Secretary Brings Down Biased Judge." The Liberty Channel ran the story with an image of Karoline Leavitt standing outside Capitol Square Court, the silver cross on her blazer catching the sun like a mirror held up to power. Then came the avalanche. Hashtags exploded across social media. "Faith on Trial, not just a cross, justice wears faith." Thousands began sharing their own stories about being silenced in courtrooms, fined for wearing crosses or hijabs, or feeling like their faith was seen as a threat instead of a right. Karoline sat at her desk in the executive office's East Wing, watching the live trends rise and crest like tides. Her inbox swelled with support. Law students, pastors, civil rights groups, and even former judges. One email simply read, "You didn't just hold your ground, you moved the ground for the rest of us." Still, Karoline didn't take a victory lap. She knew this moment needed more than symbolism. It needed structure. That afternoon, she walked into the Roosevelt conference room and placed a simple white folder on the polished oak table. Candace, Noah Merrick, and Alina Porter were already there. "This is no longer just about Clay," Karoline said, unfolding the folder. "It's about every courtroom that operates unchecked. About every person who stays silent out of fear they'll be humiliated for believing in something." Inside the folder, a draft of proposed federal legislation. The Justice Wears Faith Act. Noah leaned forward, scanning the bullet points. Mandatory anti-bias training for judges and courtroom staff. Independent citizen oversight panels. Transparent reporting of disciplinary actions. He looked up. "This is serious." Karoline nodded. "It has to be." Alina smiled. "You want to reform the bench, from the inside out." Candace tapped her phone. "The president's team just called. Creed wants you on the record. Tonight, primetime." Karoline didn't hesitate. That evening, she stepped onto the stage at St. George Civic Justice Center, facing a crowd that had filled the rotunda and overflowed into the lawn. Reporters, students, veterans, mothers with young children. Some held homemade signs, "My faith, my right." Others simply stood in silence, holding candles. The room quieted when Karoline took the podium. Her voice, calm but charged, echoed off marble walls. "Last week, I was fined $500 for wearing this." She lifted the silver cross gently between her fingers. "Not because it disrupted the court, not because I shouted or cursed or disrespected the law, but because a judge believed faith doesn't belong in the same room as justice." A pause. The crowd held its breath. "But justice," she continued, "was built to protect faith, not silence it." Applause thundered, but Karoline didn't stop. "We are proposing the Justice Wears Faith Act, not as an act of revenge, but as a promise. A promise that no one will have to choose between their rights and their religion ever again." Camera flashes fired. The speech trended within minutes. Excerpts flooded social media. Local news outlets replayed it with subtitles. One major anchor said, "It was less a political speech than a declaration of cultural intent." Even President Dalton Creed chimed in on his official account. "Religious liberty isn't just a line in the Constitution. It's a line we don't let anyone cross. Proud of Karoline Leavitt. We stand with you." Back at the courthouse, the effects rippled outward. In Texas, lawmakers launched a review of courtroom bias. In Florida, a public defender called for mandatory First Amendment training. In Ohio, a judge preemptively stepped down, citing a need for reflection. Meanwhile, Karoline returned to her office. She opened her desk drawer, pulled out the fine receipt from Clay's courtroom, creased, official, signed. She didn't shred it. She framed it. It hung just above her computer monitor the next morning. A reminder, not of humiliation, but of the moment a whisper became a voice, and a voice became a movement. Candace walked in, coffee in hand, and stared at the frame. Most people would have burned that. Karoline smiled. That's why most people never change anything. Later that day, the Liberty Channel ran a special segment titled, From Contempt to Catalyst, the Karoline Leavitt story. Interviews from people inspired by her began airing. College students, Muslim women who'd hidden their faith out of fear, Christians who'd been told to remove symbols in court. The most powerful moment came from a young woman named Ella, in Chicago. She held a tiny gold cross in her palm and said, "I used to think justice was about fear. Now I think it's about showing up with your truth, even when they try to fine you for it." As the sun set behind the Capitol dome, Karoline watched from her balcony. Below, another crowd gathered, this time unprompted. They weren't shouting, they were just present. Candles, crosses, unity. She didn't speak, not yet. She didn't need to. The system had been cracked. And through it, the light was starting to pour in. 3 months later, the echo of Karoline Leavitt's stand was no longer just a movement, it was a movement. Washington had changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, but profoundly. It began in the halls of Congress. Under the vaulted ceiling of the Rayburn House office building, a crowd filled the public gallery. Faith leaders, civic advocates, law students, even a few former defendants sat in silent anticipation as the House Judiciary Subcommittee convened. At the center of the room stood Karoline. Her silver cross still gleamed softly on the lapel of her navy blazer, but this time, no one dared ask her to remove it. Behind her, posters displayed data charts, constitutional citations, and anonymized stories from citizens across the country who had faced religious bias in court. Seated nearby were her allies, Noah Merrick, Alina Porter, and Candace Roy, each of them ready not to defend her, but to support the new law her voice had sparked. Karoline began simply, 3 months ago, I walked into a courtroom as an observer. I left that room having been fined, humiliated, and nearly silenced, for a symbol I've worn since I was 12. She paused, her tone never wavering. But today isn't about me. It's about the people who couldn't speak, who didn't have press credentials or White House IDs. It's about making sure they never have to stand alone again. She introduced the full text of the Justice Wears Faith Act. It included mandatory anti-bias training for judges and courtroom staff, transparent reporting of all courtroom disciplinary actions involving religious symbols or expressions, independent citizen oversight panels for local court systems, a federal hotline for reporting courtroom bias, managed by the Department of Justice. By the time she finished, the room was still. And then, applause, slow at first, then rising. On the committee bench, several lawmakers nodded, visibly moved. One representative, a lifelong civil rights attorney, simply whispered, "Finally." The bill passed the House with bipartisan support. Days later, the Senate followed. The Justice Wears Faith Act became law. But it wasn't just legislation, it became a template, a mirror held to the system, showing what needed to change and what already had. Across the country, signs began appearing outside courthouses. This courtroom honors freedom of faith. Training sessions rolled out, coordinated by the newly established Freedom Bench Academy. Instructors were trained not just in policy, but in empathy, in listening, in understanding that the symbols people wear are not statements of defiance, but identity, love, and belief. At one such session in D.C., a surprising figure appeared. Vernon Clay. No longer a judge, his hair a bit thinner, his voice softer, but his presence undeniable. He stood before a room of new judges and clerks, hands folded. "I didn't see it at first," he admitted. I thought I was keeping order, but I was really keeping fear alive. Karoline Leavitt showed me what courage looks like, and I'm here to make sure no one else learns the hard way." Some participants shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, but no one looked away. Meanwhile, at St. George Civic Justice Center, the transformation was literal. A mural now covered the main atrium wall. It depicted Karoline, standing at a courtroom door, holding it open. Behind her, golden light poured in, illuminating silhouettes of people from every faith and walk of life. Beneath it, in bold paint, "Justice isn't earned in silence, it's demanded in presence." Visitors stopped to take photos. Schools brought students on field trips. The mural became more than art. It became reminder, anthem, proof. Karoline herself never asked for a spotlight. But one day, back in her East Wing office, she received a hand-delivered envelope from a high school in rural Georgia. Inside was a crumpled piece of notebook paper. Scrawled in pencil, "Because of you, I wore my cross to school today and didn't hide it." She pinned it next to her framed $500 court fine. Side by side, wound and witness. Later that night, she stood on the White House balcony. Below, the city moved with the rhythm of a late spring evening. But up here, it felt still, sacred somehow. President Dalton Creed stepped out, sipping tea, eyes scanning the skyline. "You did something real, Karoline," he said softly. "This wasn't just politics. This was purpose." She smiled. "I didn't expect any of this. I just didn't want to stay silent." He nodded. "The good ones never do." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm gold across the marble buildings, Karoline's eyes lingered on the city. The courts, the churches, the homes. And somewhere in the fading light, a silver cross caught the last of the sun and kept shining. The trial was over. But the legacy was just beginning. Sometimes, the loudest stand begins with the quietest act, a refusal to bow, to remove, to retreat. In a world where power often hides behind robes and rules, it's easy to forget that freedom was never meant to be silent. Justice isn't just a courtroom word. It lives and breathes in every choice to speak, to stand, to believe. This story isn't just about what happened. It's about what's possible when someone decides that dignity isn't negotiable. If this journey stirred something in you, if it made you reflect, question, or hope, let us know. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the system, honor truth, and defend what matters. Because sometimes, the change begins with you.